Well, thank you so much. The question I get most often is not about the stuff that Skip asked me. Recently, people are asking me, why did you write this book? And so I'll try to start with that this morning. It's more historical, I guess, than logical, but I have to go back to when I was a kid. When I was 7 years old, I was born in 1935, so you can figure that up. World War II was just getting underway. I was going on 7 years old. Arkansas at that time, in fact, the entire South, was segregated. And this was on everyone's mind, this division of the races. But at 7 years of age, it was not the division of blacks and whites that got on my mind at 7 years of age, because my father worked at the Rohr Relocation Center, which was the place where the United States interred hundreds of thousands of Japanese. And because my dad worked there, he would take me with him. And I learned at 7 years of age to play with the little Japanese girls and boys, and we'd have the best time. And then I would come back to Little Rock and be treated to all of the wartime propaganda, the cartoons of Hirohito and Tojo, and Japanese with buck teeth and big glasses sticking bayonets in little children. And this was a puzzle to me as a little kid, because I had this wonderful experience playing with the little Japanese kids, but then I saw this sort of treatment back in Little Rock during the war. And it bothered me greatly, and I kept wondering, why do we have to be mad at these people simply because they're different? And then, of course, after I grew up a little bit, I went in the Marine Corps and got sent to Korea, and one of the first things that they do after you get there is schedule you for what they call an R&R, rest and recuperation trip to Japan. And so I got a chance to take a first R&R to Japan, and it was less than 10 years after the end of World War II, less than 10 years after we had dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this buddy and I decided that we wanted to go to Hiroshima. I particularly wanted to go. I've always been interested in the Japanese people since childhood. And so we went to Hiroshima, just the two of us in uniform, and when we got there, we were about the only Americans in the area. We saw no one else, just Japanese all over the place. We saw a little bit of the damage that was done during World War II. But as we were walking down the street, we saw a movie theater, and you'll never guess what was playing that day at this theater in Hiroshima. It was John Wayne starring in Flying Leathernecks. Well, we couldn't resist that, being Marines. Then we went into the theater, and they had the Japanese sub-captions in the movie, and John Wayne was busy shooting down all these Japanese planes and killing all these Japanese pilots and smiling as he did it. And we pretty soon nudged each other and decided it'd be the better part of valor to slip out of the theater quietly as we could. And so we did. But again, I began to think, well, isn't this interesting? These people who we were being told to hate back during World War II couldn't have been friendlier. They were very kind to us the whole time we were there in Hiroshima, even as the damage from the war still was there. So I've always been struck by this. And then when I got out of the Marine Corps, I came home, went to school at what was then Little Rock Junior College, met my wife Lana there, and I was on a GI Bill, and I needed to get a little extra money. So I got a job driving a delivery truck here in Little Rock for $1.50 an hour. Samuelson Cigar Company. I delivered cigars, cigarettes, and sundries to various places, mostly little drugstores and places like that, the little stores. And so one day I was driving out 14th Street, and came to the intersection of 14th and Park, wheeled around the corner in my truck, and there were all these military vehicles there. It was the Little Rock School integration crisis. And I was not really into politics at the time, but I got out of my truck, parked it, went over, and tried to listen in on what people said. People were mad as hell. And they were, cussing and screaming and fighting with one another. And once again, I was wondering, why can't people learn to live together and understand that we're all different? And so, again, this was on my mind. And then when I was in the FBI, I had a rather dramatic experience because I was sent to Newark, New Jersey, which of course is the armpit of the New York metropolitan area. And I was there for 2.5 years, which included the time that Newark experienced the riots when the city was burned down, literally, and 26 people were killed. And once again, it was a clash of cultures. And so that bothered me, and I had occasion to be right in the middle of that and to experience that once again. And then I came home to Arkansas and got involved with Governor Rockefeller and began to work for the development of a two-party system in Arkansas. And I experienced political hatred, hate mail under my windshield wipers when I would try to go to a county fair and that sort of thing. I even went to Marlton one time to try to help Governor Rockefeller install a new sheriff and oust the incumbent sheriff, Marlon Hawkins, and the city policeman there stuck a shotgun in my stomach and threatened to kill me because I was there on behalf of this man that was supposed to be sheriff, according to Governor Rockefeller. So again, that's just another form of hatred. I've always been a student of these cultural clashes, which take many shapes. They can be clashes that result from sexual differences, that result from racial differences, political differences. We are all different. God made each and every one of us different. And it's a wonderful thing that we're different, but it does create prejudice, these differences. That's the root cause in my mind. My experience in life has taught me that that's where these problems arise. Well, all that gets me close to the point where I'm going to tell you why I wrote this book. In 1972, a group known as the Group Inc. moved into Cleburne County, Arkansas, into Greer's Ferry, and they set up a commune there. They bought an old chicken house and converted it into a commune, and about 20 families moved in. Some of you may remember that incident. They moved in, and they were going to start a little business there in town, a dinner theater. And now imagine this was 1972. Think a little bit about the culture and what we were going through in the 1960s, the late 1960s and the early 1970s, with all of the demonstrations and the assassinations and the conflicts between the hippies and people who were opposed to that sort of lifestyle. That was the era in which the commune chose to move into Greer's Ferry. Well, they weren't received all that well by the local people at the time, who decided that they would run them off and drive them out of town. And so one night, 23 of the good old boys gathered up outside the commune and began to throw rocks on top of the chicken house, fire pistols, and shout obscenities. Well, it scared the bejesus out of the people inside, particularly the little children. And so the prosecuting attorney, the state police came and quieted it all down. The prosecuting attorney charged 23 men with night riding, which is the law that we used to use to control the Ku Klux Klan way back in the early 1900s. And so these 23 men then came down to Searcy to see if I would represent them. And I said, well, you're entitled to representation, so I'll represent you, and I did. And we had a big trial in Heber Springs, lasted a week, and it was a good thing to have the trial because it was a chance for the community to vent and to discuss this situation and decide what's right, what's wrong, how do we live with people who are different. And so the trial, as I said, went on for a week, and ultimately the judge discharged 20 of the men, but found 3 of them guilty of disturbing the peace, and they spent several weekends in jail, and that was the end of the matter. But here's the important point. That trial proved to be a catharsis for the entire community, a way to work through this clash of cultures. So I always kind of wanted to write about that. And after I finished my memoir and was suffering something akin to postpartum depression, I had nothing to do. I decided, well, maybe I ought to take a crack at writing that up. And as I got started into writing the story, I said, you know, I really shouldn't be writing about something where I was the lawyer. And so I decided, well, I'll make a fictional story about a culture clash. And so I decided that in place of having a commune come into a county and create a clash of cultures, I would have a young gay man move into a community in the midst of the 1960s. In 1968, imagine the culture that existed in the community at that time. And so that was my fictional idea, and so I created a couple of fictional counties in North Arkansas, and that was the setting for my story. Well, my protagonist is a young man named Aubrey Hatfield, and I borrowed a little bit from Dale Bumper's background on this. My protagonist, Aubrey, was just out of law school. He's a very young man. He had married his sweetheart that he had been in love with since grade school, but he was going to practice a little law and also run a hardware store, which is what Dale did over in Charleston. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So I made my man, my protagonist, Aubrey, the owner of a hardware store that had been in his family for years, and yet he was also going to be a new young lawyer in town. And all he and his wife wanted out of life was to live an unfussy life in the hills of Arkansas. That was their dream. That's all they wanted. And he was trying to make a living being a deputy prosecuting attorney and a jackleg lawyer on the side, and then running the hardware store too. That was the way they were going to get by. Well, as it happens, at that point, the young gay man moves into town and is not well received, to put it lightly, and he is murdered brutally and tortured brutally. It was essentially a lynching. And to make matters worse, the authorities then turned a blind eye. There's an old prosecuting attorney in my book, old school, and a sheriff who was a real bigot. And so they turned a blind eye to this killing, and nothing happened. Aubrey was the deputy prosecuting attorney, and he was worried that nothing was happening. There was nothing going on in the investigation to try to track down the killers. And so as this began to play on his mind, his young wife, Prissy, was very supportive of that notion. She said, surely they won't turn a blind eye to this. Well, Aubrey decided to confront the sheriff and insist that they call in the state police to do something about this. And so they did have a real confrontation, Aubrey and the sheriff. They butted heads. And the sheriff then turned to Aubrey. And any of you who have practiced law, and I see some of my colleagues here in some of the counties out in Arkansas, may recognize this sheriff. Aubrey confronted the sheriff, and the sheriff glared at him and stood up. Aubrey was saying, we need to get the state police in. We need to do more. We need to find out who did this killing. The sheriff glared at him and stood up. They've done a little of that, he hesitated, and then he pointed his finger at Aubrey. But let's get something straight, Aubrey. I run this county. My boys and I are taking the lead on this one, And if I need the state police to do more, I'll call them and tell them what to do. Besides, Fred Cooksey, the prosecuting attorney, says we ought to take it slow and easy, and I agree with him 100%. Well, Aubrey was puzzled by that. He didn't quite know what to say, so he decided he would appeal to the prosecuting attorney. He did, and the prosecuting attorney took the sheriff's side of things. This bothered Aubrey greatly, and this is a crucial point in the storyline, and it's one that we all face throughout life. The proposition of standing up for what you know is right. And Aubrey at that point worried greatly about this, and when the prosecutor told him that he was sticking with the sheriff, Aubrey goes back to the hardware store, and I write this about what was going through his mind. Aubrey thought to himself, "There's a certainty in hardware and tools. Everything has a purpose. Yes, our displays in the store are jumbled up and overcrowded. That's gotten worse over the years, but you can still find what you need, and you can always straighten things out." Aubrey put a fallen tool back where it belonged, but his mind was grinding, rummaging through wisps of memory and the jumbled up uncertainties of law and politics. Something inside him was judging and sorting, but Aubrey was not listening to that voice. He shied away from the painful work of unjumbling right from wrong. He was looking for a hiding place, and he found one. I need to lighten up. The work of doing justice depends on people, and people are not perfect. It's always messy. I should not judge Cooksey, the prosecutor, or the sheriff, because I do not know their hearts or their motivations. That's why I did not press my point with Fred, the prosecutor. What happened to Ike, the young gay man, should not happen to anyone, homosexual or not. But the case is only 3 weeks old. Maybe it'll all work out. I'll focus on other things. I'll work here in the hardware. I'll do the minor cases at municipal court. That's what I'll do. I'll let the sheriff control the Ike Swanson case. That's what they want. There's no need to bother Prissy with all this. It's complicated. I'll just keep it to myself. It's hard enough for me to understand how the justice system works, and I'm a lawyer. This was the point when Aubrey rationalized his decision to back away and not stand up for what he knew to be right. This is when he started his trip to the valley. And it was an important turning point in the book because, as it turned out, the journey to the valley for Aubrey was a very long one because he had a very unpleasant experience in his life. He's lost his wife, he lost their young stillborn baby, lost his mother. All these things converged on him at one time. And Aubrey took consolation from an old friend who was his alter ego. Dwayne Pollard is the character, who's an interesting guy in his own right. But Aubrey was in denial and did not want to face this and do the right thing. And so he was so troubled by it until one day, and this is the part that Mike Beebe liked the best about my book. In walks a man named Blackie Blackburn, who was a legend in that part of the country. He was an old-time lawyer who was a colorful character and had given the prosecuting attorney fits time and time again. And he walked in and confronted Aubrey and said, "I'm here, I represent the mother of the deceased young gay man, and she believes you all are not doing your duty, and she thinks you're part of the problem, Aubrey." Well, that struck him hard and hit him, and that's when he turned to Dwayne for counsel, and for help and to try to figure his way out of the situation. And Dwayne told him, you should resign. You don't need to be part of this. And there's nothing you can do. You're not the sheriff, you're not the prosecuting attorney. And so Aubrey was wrestling with the idea of whether he should resign or stay on the job and fight. And that's when he lost his wife and his mom and everybody else. And he just couldn't handle all of that and went into the valley, deeply, deeply into the valley. And his mother, Aubrey's mother, was a true Christian lady who had told Aubrey all his life, you can't know about heaven if you don't know about hell. And she was a pretty good student of, a pretty good theologian in her own right, and had read widely and studied all the works of Dante and others who had written on this subject. And so she always tried to get Aubrey to do this. Well, Aubrey was in such a depressed state after his wife died that one day he was sitting at home and he decided to go into the library where his mom had kept all her books. He pulled Dante's book off the shelf, determined to look at this proposition of, and he said to himself, what about hell? Where do I stand on the scale of good to bad, a good and bad? So he opened Dante's book, grimacing, wondering how long it would take to find passages that would apply to his life and the sense of despair he felt. It did not take long. The third canto of the first poem, Inferno, hit him right between the eyes. Dante's verse took Aubrey through the gate of hell with its foreboding inscription, abandon every hope, ye who enter. The poet told of hearing the cries and torment of the neutrals, those indecisive cowards who were so weak-minded in life that they were relegated to the vestibule of hell. So pathetic were they, the miscreants who maintained their neutrality in a time of moral crisis, that they did not deserve a place in hell proper. Aubrey squirmed as he read about the lost souls in the vestibule. He put the book down and sorted through the memories of what he had done and not done about the lynching. He knew he could not deny the strength of Dante's argument. He had resigned as deputy prosecuting attorney to assuage the guilt he felt for making a mistake that hurt others, particularly Ike's mother. But his encounter with the neutrals brought shame, a deeper, more painful feeling about himself personally, a feeling that he was the mistake. The next verses told how the neutrals faced an eternity of chasing a black banner with swarms of insects stinging them mercilessly, tears streaming down their bodies, gathering in putrid puddles, swirling with worms. Aubrey nodded. Yes, that is exactly how the shame of cowardly indifference feels. The punishment fits the crime. His heart ached. He had found his place in Dante's hell. So Aubrey is as deep into the valley as you can be at this moment. He has seen wrong, did nothing about it. He's lost all his family. He's lost his faith. He continues on as a usher, the longest serving usher at the First Methodist Church, but a man who had no faith. He just served as usher. That's all there was to it. Now, I could have probably ended the book here and made some points about what Aubrey should or shouldn't have done, but it occurred to me since I set the book in 1968 to take a look at the culture that existed at that point in time, that it would be a good idea to carry my characters forward to the year 2005 so that we could measure today's culture against the culture of 1968 and to examine what happens to people along the way. Do they change? Do they adapt? Did Aubrey change? Did Aubrey adapt? How do we deal with this perplexing problem of our differences? Has that changed since the 60s? Did it change for Aubrey? These were the things that were on my mind as I took my story into 2005, some 36 years after the lynching of the young gay man. I don't want to give the story away because I'd like for you to read. I'd like for you to read the book, but the question that I raise 36 years afterwards, when Aubrey is in the valley, can he get out of the valley? If so, how does he get out of the valley? And I can just give you a couple of tips. Boys and baseball were a big part of it. Aubrey he's asked by some young boys, one is a nephew of his, if he will coach the American Legion baseball team. And Aubrey had been a baseball player as a kid, so that gave him a little hope to get back with boys and baseball. For the first time in 36 years, he begins to have a little hope in life and feel good about himself. And then his old buddy Dwayne comes up with the idea, Aubrey, you want to earn some money. He just didn't have any money at all. He just practiced law hand to mouth. His hardware store had been driven out of business by the big box stores, so he was just making ends meet. But he wanted to help this young nephew because the young nephew was talking about going to Iraq in the Marine Corps, and he didn't want that to happen. So Aubrey wanted to get some kind of job where he could make some money, and his old buddy Dwayne comes up with the idea, why don't you run for prosecuting attorney? And he had a theory about how he could win that seat. And so Aubrey decided to do that, and he did, and he won. So at that point, Aubrey is now the prosecuting attorney in 2005, and wouldn't you know it, there's another murder of another homosexual man in the county, and now it's Aubrey's responsibility to dig into that and decide what to do about it. And so that's the setting in the second part of the book. And Aubrey then, well, I just can't tell you what he does because it'd give away the story. But the question is there a second chance for redemption for Aubrey and for the citizens of Campbell County who also turned a blind eye to the lynching back in 1968. Other problems crop up, problems that you're familiar with if you watch the TV news and all the stories about the various trials that take place of people and how the media gets on that and how the advocates come out to try to make points for their causes. We see it every night on TV. So the second part of the book deals closely with this question of how do we have fair trial and free press at the same time. It's a tenuous balance. And then comes the proposition of gay panic. What is that? Well, in this second case, the homosexual man was a car dealer, and he was driving down the road and stopped to pick up a young boy who was jogging on the side of the road, football star, and he picked him up and said, say, let's talk about your getting a scholarship at the college that I went to. And so the boy gets into the car with him, and a homosexual advance is made, and the young boy, who was carrying in his hands as part of his workout 5-pound dumbbells in each hand, hits him, and it kills him. Hits him 5 times, kills him. And so Aubrey is now challenged with what to charge, how to charge this young man after they caught him and interviewed him. And the young man readily admitted that he had done this, but he said it was because he had been approached by the homosexual man and that he panicked. And so that was the defense that they offered in the big trial that takes place in the second part of the book. All across this country, in fact, all across the world, in instances where homosexual people have been killed, many, many times the person who is charged with killing or striking or hurting that person claims that they panicked. And that was the claim that was made in this case, gay panic. It's not a legal defense. I see Judge McGowan here in the audience. It's not a legal defense, but it is a strategy that lawyers use to try to get their client off. And the strategy is they will do and say whatever they can to show the homosexual man as a monster and to incite all the prejudice they can from the members of the jury, and in that way get the verdict that they're looking for. That's the way the gay panic strategy works. And so I was very interested in this, having spent my life trying lawsuits and working in that arena. And so that's where the book goes, and most people who have read it tell me that they kind of like the way it works out in the end. There's some really, really colorful characters who show up in the second part of the book. And it ultimately gets resolved it's a complicated way in that it gets resolved. But much like the case that I tried back in Heber Springs, the one about the commune moving to town, the trial, the big trial, proves to be a catharsis for the people of Campbell County. And they vent, they sort out what's right and what's wrong. And in the end, I believe justice is reached. And that's the challenge of the book, really is twofold. One, first and foremost, you cannot be in this world, in this time when we have to work out these differences with each other. We've got to rise to the occasion. That's why I dedicated my book this way: for the neutrals who walk among us. And I have signed many of these books to my friends, and I would say, I see my friend Porter there and say, "Porter, you ain't no neutral." And then I would sign Ed Bethune. You have to stand for what's right. The worst thing in the world is to turn a blind eye or to be indifferent. Get this quote, I love this. It's from Bliss Carman, a Canadian poet. "Indifference may not wreck a man's life at any one turn, but it will destroy him with a kind of dry rot in the long run." That's what was happening to Aubrey when he was in the valley. Dry rot. Dry rot. That's what indifference will do. So, my book is not about gay marriage. Those of you who've read it know that. But it is an invitation to the reader to think about our differences and to think about how we can and must work through that challenge and to make the most of our differences without letting these emotions of hate and prejudice rise up, because they will for sure destroy any chance that there is for justice. That's the real challenge that we face, I think, going forward, not just in Campbell County, Arkansas, but nationwide, perhaps worldwide, is this proposition of learning to live with one another. You'll be interested to know that originally I was going to name my book, title it Differences. And I thought it was a pretty cool name. And in fact, I had some artwork done, and they had the title Differences with one of the F's turned backwards in it. I thought that's pretty cool, but I was persuaded that it was too esoteric, that I needed something that would catch the attention of the public. And I'm now satisfied that we did, in fact, catch the attention of the public with this title, Gay Panic in the Ozarks. For the lawyers in the room, you'll be interested to know that you just missed some CLE credit, continuing legal education credit, because I'm going to give this presentation in 2 weeks at Fayetteville on the weekend of the University of Alabama at Birmingham football game. And lawyers who attend will be given 1 hour of CLE ethics credit. You'll also be interested to know that it's a 2-part program. The first hour of the program is presented by a professor at the university who is going to explain all the ramifications of the latest Fayetteville ordinance on discrimination, to be followed by a presentation by Ed Bethune called Gay Panic in the Ozarks. I think we're going to have a good turnout, and I'm quite sure that the media will be interested in that proposition. So that's kind of my story, and I hope you will read the book. I'm so excited. The class from Magnet Cove has taken this as a project to try to figure out what good comes of the book Gay Panic in the Ozarks. And I hope that I've helped you and didn't disabuse any notions that you've already formed about my book. But I thought it was important to try to tell you how I feel about this business, why I feel the way I do because of my personal history, and to encourage you to learn those important lessons that Aubrey had to learn the hard way, and to stand up for what you see to be right and to fight against what you see to be wrong. So thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I couldn't help but notice that Aubrey's mentor in the book was a guy by the name of Dwayne Pollard.
Yes.
Is there a mentorship link there, maybe?
There is. I started practicing law in Searcy with a wonderful fellow named Odell Pollard, who is very close to passing on these days, and learned a lot from him. And there was another gentleman in Searcy called Dwayne Treat, who spelled his name, Dwayne, we got a Dwayne here in the class, yeah. He spelled his name without a Y also, and so that's the way my Dwayne spelled his name. But I sort of took composites of those fellows and made a character out of them in the book. Dwayne is a character that I really, really love because Dwayne was a World War II veteran, a Marine, of course. Lewis Bracey, my friend, who was also in the Marines at the same time I was. In my books, by the way, there will always be a Marine, and there will always be a mule. The killing in this book took place at the Spradlin Mule Farm up in Possum. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, Skip.
I detected Dwayne and Pollard, so I thought that was. Right. Anybody have a question? Yes, Luke.
Hello, my name is Luke Frauenthal. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. And my family is from Cleburne County, so as much as I'd love to read about the trial in Heber Springs, I want to thank you for the timeliness of your subject matter with a lot of new groups for young people starting, and especially with LGBT issues in the legislature and in the courts in Arkansas. I'm really interested in your conversations with the neutrals. You said you mentioned talking with Governor Beebe, and I'd wondered about how some of your conversations with your friends in Arkansas politics have gone.
I think that's an interesting question because I've had people from the far left read my book, and I've had people from the far right read my book, and I get no quarrel from people on either end because the proposition that I try to put forward in the book through my characters is that we are all different and we must learn to live with one another. I sent out a tweet the other day, which I don't do a lot of them, but I did send one out the other day, which said, "Love thy neighbors, but what if they're different?" And I got some reaction to that, actually, because it is an interesting proposition. Lana and I have lived in lots of places, and we've had people of all descriptions as neighbors. Anyway, back to your central point. Look, that's, I hope, a lesson that everybody can agree to. The point of this book is, look, you can't kill them, you can't lynch them, you can't torture them, At the same time, I think the point of the book is that if I hold one view about gay marriage and you hold another, that's okay. We're entitled to our individual views about these very difficult subjects. One may be coming from a totally secular viewpoint, another may be coming from a totally religious viewpoint. But we're entitled to those, and again, because those views are different, we still must respect the right of each of us to hold these different views, but that doesn't mean that we should go draw pistols or pull knives out and go to work on each other. You see what I mean? That's the essential point of my book. And then to take a position, go ahead and say your position, whatever it may be. And I expect we have all sorts of positions here in this room. Say your position. Don't be a neutral. Don't be indifferent. Speak up. Thanks for that question, by the way.
Any other questions? We don't have a question from Magnet Cove? Surely, to goodness, there is a question. Who's going to be the student representative that's going to ask a question, or I might just walk over and give you a microphone? No question from anybody from Magnet Cove.
They had a question they all worked out
No,
on
we
the bus.
were talking about it before. Then someone explained to me how you came about getting this book, reading the book, what prompted that. Who can tell me that story of how this book came about in your class?
One of you guys must do it because you did it.
Come on, one of you guys did it. Who's going to do it? Who's going to tell the story? How did you choose this book?
Well, I'll pass it to Jesse, yeah. Well, Miss Rocket just told us about the book, and she didn't tell us we had to read it. I mean, it's optional because we're taking a concurrent credit class. It's a college class, but we're taking it at the high school. And I mean, just by the cover, it looks like it's going to be about something that it's not about. So we decided to give it a shot, and we read it, and we got into it, and we really liked it.
Thanks.
Yeah, Miss Rocket, she gave us the choice between 3 books, and she told us a little bit about each book, and we all decided that we wanted to read this one. And I think we kind of decided on it because we live in such a small town, and there's intolerance everywhere where we are. Like, there's indifference, there's neutrals, there's people that just will not even talk with you about anything like this. So I think it really stood out to us just because of that.
Good, thanks.
Well, it's a great book about social change, and it is a great book. And even though it is fiction, it is based on a lot of stories from experience, including Cleburne County. And I remember that trial. I remember that book. You got something there?
Yeah, this may be a good time just to read. You all know, you can see that the book ends up with this enormous trial where all these issues are discussed. But Aubrey, having come out of the valley, is now the prosecuting attorney, and he's trying to persuade the jurors to set aside their prejudices and do the right thing. He's trying to say to them, don't be a neutral, but he needs to say it in a special way. He goes through all of his arguments in the case, and then he says this: Aubrey could see that the jurors were listening, but he did not want to make the mistake that speakers often make, repeating points already made or speaking too long. He considered stopping and took a step back, but then he changed his mind. He had one more thing he was determined to say. It was sensitive, but he was going to say it anyway. Now, to the jury, now you may be saying to yourself, not to worry, Mr. Prosecutor, I'm not biased. Aubrey took a step back and pointed to himself. I wish I could say that, but I think of the scripture. Who can understand the error of his ways? Cleanse me from my secret faults. When Spike Spivey, the defense attorney, appealed to your emotions, for instance, when he tried to say that Randy Trice was a monster, he is whispering to the devil in you, those secret faults, the error of our ways. Our better angels tell us to overcome our greatest vice, the refusal to see wrong and do something about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Congressman Ed Bethune. John?
Oh, yeah.
Wait a minute, John. Wait for the mic. Hey, get the mic, John. Hold on just a minute.
While they're getting the mic to John, thank you, John. I was born in the hill country, the foothills of the Ozarks in Pocahontas, Arkansas, where the foothills actually began. And I've always been in love with this old courthouse, which is the oldest courthouse in the state of Arkansas. And I wanted to put a picture of it on the book. And so Lana and I drove up and made some pictures, color pictures. They were really nice, but color picture didn't seem to work with my book. And so I wanted a black and white picture, and I looked and I saw John Gill, who just spoke, had taken this picture that's on the front of this book years ago and published it as part of his work in collecting pictures of all the old courthouses. And I thought it was just perfect. And I wrote John, I said, would you give me permission to use that on the cover of my book? And he graciously agreed, and that's how that picture got on the front of the book. Thank you all.